now recording, and I'll stop sharing my screen, and we'll be just about ready to hand over to Susan, and yes, we'll take it from there. Okay. So Susan,
you're right for me to go. Yep, you're right for me to go, Aggie.
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Susan Bosch here. I'm the president of the Woorndoo Land Protection Group. My role is very brief this morning, and I'm a fast talker apparently, so I'll whip through some thank yous. Well, first of all, I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I know there's going to be a formal welcome to country following my introduction. Anyway, welcome one and all. As I said, my job today is just to run through a few thank yous. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to Aggie. Thanks, Aggie, for getting this seminar up off the ground for us today. It's great that we've been able to accommodate 140 odd, 150 people, which is more than we can usually host in the Woorndoo Rec Reserve. Other than that, I'd like to say thanks to DELP for our Biodiversity On-Ground Action Community Action Grant. This is the reason why we're here today, essentially. It's a big part of what we do with our grasslands in Woorndoo. Also, more generally, the Glenelg Hopkins CMA and Landcare Victoria. Through them, we've received some funding for our seed production area, and the expansion of that certainly, and the mapping that has been undertaken by Lincoln Kern. And I see Lincoln's here today. Welcome. Yes, thanks, Aggie. Thanks to the Moyne Shire for our Community Assistance Fund. That allowed us to buy equipment, and soon we're in the process of commissioning a new sign for our grasslands. To the Southwest Community Foundation, through them we received a grant to purchase a projector computer thing and a loudspeaker, which we're not needing today, but maybe for our next function that we hold next year, that might be useful. And thank you to all our volunteers. We do lots of seed propagation, seed collecting, a whole host of things, and you're all welcome to join those when we need more helpers, please. A special thank you to David Franklin for his ongoing commitment to native grassland conservation, and for his generous hosting of our nursery, our seed production area, and the requirements and all the extra efforts he goes to there. Thank you, David. I guess most of all, I'd like to express my gratitude to John Del Pratt. John, together with David Franklin, really are the tour de force behind our project, and the reason really for our Landcare group existing, really. Without their passion, their enthusiasm, their commitment, I don't think we'd be sitting here today in this seminar. Finally, just a special thanks to other members of the Woorndoo Land Protection Committee. They are Jodie, Carolyn and Liz Fenton. They're all responsible for our spreadsheets, our paying bills, mailing lists, research, photos, and just general gophering. So thank you to everybody. I hope I haven't missed anyone. If I have, then I'll leave that till later on. But anyway, welcome all, and I hope you enjoy today. I think it will be a fantastic session. Thanks for that. Bye-bye.
Beautiful. Thank you very much for that, Susan. And that's great because we're already 3 minutes ahead on the agenda, which is brilliant. So, but without further ado,
I told you I was a fast talker.
Yeah, that's great. Now, so I'm just going to faff about and get my chat screen up on another screen so I can respond to your messages, because for some reason this isn't letting me respond to your messages. But there has been a question from Joan about volume. I can turn my volume up, but unfortunately, it's you all control your own volume. So I've got myself on maximum. Again, all I could suggest is maybe you jump out and jump back in again. I'm sorry about that. There will be a few little technical glitches that just get us, but but good. And I'm getting other people saying volume's fine, so that's great. So look, I'm going to introduce Charlie Davey, he's the Indigenous Partnerships Coordinator at the Glenelg Hopkins CMA with me. And Charlie is very kindly and very enthusiastically said he would love to do a formal acknowledgement to country. We did invite Eastern Ma, but everyone's just very, very busy. So Charlie will do an acknowledgement to country for us now. So Charlie, I'll hand over to you, please.
Thanks very much, Aggie. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country that we're all meeting on today and pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and their future generations as well. I'm in the Glenelg Hopkins CMA office in Hamilton, and the traditional owners here are the Gunditjmara. So I'm on Gunditjmara country. And I know up in Woorndoo that we're discussing and celebrating today, it's the traditional owners of the Ma Nations, represented by Eastern Ma Aboriginal Corporation. So I acknowledge those traditional owners and the traditional owners of country that we're all meeting on today, all across Victoria and beyond. And I'd also like to pay my respects to any traditional owners and elders who are present here today with us as part of this meeting. It's a bit of a shame that we're not all together and enjoying the country that we're discussing, but it's also something to celebrate. I think that we can come together from a lot of different parts of Victoria and share these sorts of events and be really adaptable. And I've really enjoyed the fact that acknowledgements of country and welcomes to country have really adapted to these settings as well. And people have slipped into the custom of being able to acknowledge traditional owners across the places where people are meeting.
Sorry.
Aggie, are you about to say something?
Yeah, I'm just trying to push in. Could you turn your camera on, please, Charlie?
Yeah,
Sorry.
look, my camera's on, Aggie. I'm not sure why.
Oh, okay. Oh, don't we just love technology? Okay,
why
sorry.
I'm not visible. Yeah.
I should have mentioned that to people when you're speaking, if you can have your camera on. Sorry. Okay. I can send a picture around if people want to know what Charlie looks like, I'm sure. Sorry, please continue.
I've just turned off my, I've just moved from one camera to another, and let me see if that makes any difference. I've got two cameras here.
Okay.
Am I visible now?
No, sorry.
Visible to myself anyway.
Yeah, that's okay. He's a good looking fella, guys, so yeah.
Thanks, Aggie. And I was going to talk about my background too, but I'll move on to that a bit later. So look, what I'm doing when I acknowledge traditional owners as a non-Aboriginal person myself, I'm really acknowledging a culture and people that have been looking after this country that we're talking about today, and country all across Australia, in a way that has really maximised the health and long-term sustainability and richness of that country. So as someone who works for a land management organisation, the CMA, and I'm sure a lot of you do as well, and are involved in groups that do exactly that, we measure our success by the diversity, the biodiversity, and the richness of the country that we're looking after. And when we think about diversity, biodiversity, species richness, the traditional owners, the Ma Nations, were absolutely elite in managing and looking after country. So there's a professional element to this acknowledgement when we respect people who have a very deep knowledge and an experience and a great success over literally thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, and really thousands of generations of maintaining country in what we now call a sustainable way. At the moment, in our organisation, we're working on the regional catchment strategies, and that's a 6-year document with a 20 to 30 year vision for what our region is going to look like through our processes and through our partnerships. So that's the time frame, a generation or so, that we often tend to think in, and often it's even shorter than that. And when I'm acknowledging traditional owners, I'm acknowledging a culture that has been doing this work in time frames that we don't even really imagine in a realistic sense in our culture and our community. Now, there's a key difference between a welcome to country and an acknowledgement of country. So as I said, I'm not a traditional owner, and so I'm providing an acknowledgement of country. And as Aggie said, we do, as a matter of course, invite the traditional owner groups to provide a formal welcome when we run events, but there's just a lot going on for them. At the moment, the Eastern Maar Aboriginal Corporation is negotiating a traditional owner settlement agreement with the state of Victoria, which is a kind of shortcut version of native title. It has very similar results in determining title to land, but it's just a bit of a quicker process than going through federal native title process, which they did about 10 years ago. But it is still a very time-consuming process, and people who would much rather be working on land and working in partnerships are sort of drawn into that really political and legal processes. It's a really common thing, unfortunately. So yeah, just to note that difference between welcome to country and acknowledgement of country. Traditional Aboriginal cultures are very much built on respect, the demonstration and the acceptance of respect. And to my understanding, the process of acknowledgements of country and welcome to country have a very, very long heritage. So that when you're a traditional owner 200 or 2,000 years ago visiting country that was not your own, there would be a process of acknowledging the owners of that country, the people that belong to that country. And similarly, if you were a traditional owner hosting visitors to your country, there would be a formal process of welcome. So what we're doing as an organisation and as individuals is trying to reinstitute that demonstration of respect. And we know that over a couple of hundred years, our culture hasn't always been great at demonstrating that respect. These acknowledgements are a very important part of reinstituting and showing our respect for that culture. So when I spoke to John Clark at Eastern Maar just about our plans to, well, initially invite them to do a welcome to country, which they had to decline, but as a plan B, me doing an acknowledgement, he said, yeah, that's fine, but just make sure people understand that you're not speaking on behalf of traditional owners, you're not speaking on behalf of the Maar nations. And that's a very important thing to understand, so that when I'm sharing what knowledge I have and what I've learnt from Eastern Maar people and Gunditjmara people, it's really only my understanding of what I've learnt through my role here at the CMA, and I'm certainly not speaking on behalf of traditional owners. Aggie, have I got another 5 minutes just to talk about some of the work that we do with Eastern Maar?
Can I give you 3 minutes?
3 minutes, yeah, sounds good. So the Eastern Maar Aboriginal Corporation represents the Maar nations. So there's a number of tribes. There's Maar, there's Eastern Gunditjmara, Djabbarong, Peekwurrong, Girai Wurrung, Kern Kapan, and Yarrawach. And those people all descend now from 11 ancestral families. And the role of Eastern Maar Aboriginal Corporation is to make decisions through interacting and engaging with those ancestral families. So they can't make any decisions on behalf of Maar people without consulting with the 11 families. And that's a big part of why the Aboriginal traditional owner groups are often seen as being quite slow in responses. So that we want an answer to a particular issue in a week, it will often take a lot longer than that for those organisations to basically undertake their proper democratic processes and what they're engaged to do. And it's very similar for Burrinja Gudgeon in the north of our catchment, based in Horsham, and for the Gunditjmara group as well. So Gunditjmara and Eastern Maar are very closely related. So Maar and Mara are words that mean people, and they basically see the region from the border and even across the border in the lower Glenelg catchment, right across towards Ballarat and Geelong, although not that far, I shouldn't say that, but in that vicinity is Maar and Mara country, and they're very close kin. The work that we're doing with the Eastern Maar at the moment is largely around cultural burning, but Eastern Maar are really not keen to launch into burning at the moment. They really want to do a lot more research to understand how country should be managed before that they want to get out there and put fire on the ground, which I think is a pretty respectable position. They see their process that they're going through as they regain control of their country in more meaningful ways and regain title over land. They really see it as a generational process of learning over 10, 20, 30 years, the skills that they need and regaining some of that cultural knowledge before they get right out there and sort of start taking on burning and other management practices. I can wrap up there, but thank you very much for the invitation and the honour of doing an acknowledgement for the event today.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Charlie. That was a brilliant rundown. Now, John Delprat is going to be our first formal speaker. So while John's just getting his presentation loaded up, John will be sharing his screen with us. I'll give you a very quick background to John. So John's a horticultural scientist and an honorary fellow with the University of Melbourne. He lectured at the university's Burnley campus prior to retirement. His teaching and research focused on plant production, seed technology, weed science, and the restoration of temperate native grasslands. More recently, he's been a volunteer with the Woorndoo Land Protection Group and their work conserving and restoring diverse native grassland on local roadsides. So John will be presenting on the Woorndoo project. So John, if you're ready, I will hand over to you. And now hopefully everyone can see John's screen. He's sharing a PowerPoint presentation.
Yes, we can see that.
Thanks, Aggie. Thank you very much, and welcome to everyone. It's a wonderful, wonderful turnout. Thank you very much. I also thank speakers for the time that they have put into the exercise for us. So some critical questions from what we're doing. What and where is Woorndoo? We've had a little bit of that. What is the Woorndoo project? We've got some money and how do we spend it? Was the project successful, etc. Now, Woorndoo is a wonderful place, a hotspot for temperate natural grassland diversity, and it features these beautiful three-chain roads which allow for fabulous opportunities for studying these landscapes and restoring them. That's the Woorndoo Common. We'll hear from from Amy Jackson later about her work with the linear program. Woorndoo Common, lovely floral display each season, and it's maintained beautifully by the local CFA brigade, and that's what it'll look like after an autumn burn, coming back with a heavy growth of themata, but of course there's massive wildflower in amongst that as well. So please visit Woorndoo whenever you can. And where is Woorndoo? Well, you can see from the map there that it's in fact the centre of the universe, but it's down in southwest Victoria. It's a small, it's a agricultural and rural area with a village which is Woorndoo itself, or Woorndoo as some would say, as I probably should be saying. The common is right in the centre of the village, and we're situated just over the Salt Creek. And interestingly, the Salt Creek forms a boundary between the VBP, the Victorian Basalt Plain, and the Dundas system. So on the Woorndoo side of Salt Creek, we've got sedimentary soils. On the eastern side, where we are on the Woorndoo-Streatham Road, just a short walk from Woorndoo, that's on basalt-derived soils. So. And the understory or the ground flora is very similar in both areas in terms of species composition, and we've got to learn a lot more about whether just the adaptations of the various species to the two different soil systems. That Woorndoo-Streatham Road that we're working on, that's where we have our research sites. That's used for multiple purposes these days. It was, even within David Franklin's memory, there was a lot more native temperate grassland on that on that road. A lot of it's gone across either to quite productive roadside cropping. Now, I understand that that cropping is done for community benefit, but there's quite an expanse of it. In other areas, it's not used, in my view, quite so productively in that the locals will plough it for fire safety, but often it's not then maintained in that condition, and it goes to an exotic vegetation which is highly flammable and very productive, as you can see there with the shot on the right. The Woorndoo project is, well, it's really a name I gave to our funding from DELP. Well, we achieved that funding about 3 years ago, and it's just a shorthand to describe that particular project. And that project was to restore further grassland on the Woorndoo end of the Woorndoo-Streatham road. It's a 3-chain road, so we have a wide expanse to work with, and that's the restoration on which all this is based. That's the initial 1.25 hectares, which the Woorndoo Land Protection Group under David Franklin's guidance and with assistance from Richard Hodgson from the Moyne Shire. That was direct sown in 2013, and it now forms a wonderful expanse of very seasonally very colourful temperate native grassland. I don't refer to this as natural grassland because that I'd like to reserve, that term we like to reserve for the remnants. It's a wonderful mix of initially wallaby grasses primarily. That's the pioneer crop that goes in, but it's mixed in with a range of daisies and other forbs, other flowering forbs, and there's also a component of kangaroo grass as well, which is beginning to express now after about 5 or 6 years. Standing at the eastern end of that restoration, you can see what was it was laid out on that cropped land that had been there prior to that, and looking towards the east there, that's looking in towards the cropped area that eventually became our 2019 restoration under this grant. So we received the grant in 2017. It was initially a 2-year grant, and the intention was to extend the initial restoration by another 1.25 hectares to give a total of 2.5 as a continuous strip. And it's on a 3-chain road, so it's a wide strip, 35 to 40 metres wide. Within that grant, we also undertook 3 experiments on the existing 2013 site. We undertook to provide annual engagement, and you're all joining into the 4th of those events. In 2000, the Dundonald wind farm was built during this period, and there were roadworks going on beside the site, and those road constructors, with Dundonald wind farm's approval, completed our soil preparation for the 1.25 hectare restoration, and that saved us some money, and that allowed us to then extend to a 3-year program and to do some planting within that new restoration, so particularly kangaroo grass, to see if we could kickstart the kangaroo grass component of that work. All the work scheduled under the grant have been completed, and I'm suggesting a virtual high five and a group hug for all of us, because it's been a wonderful undertaking. So to achieve that 1.25 hectares of additional direct sowing, we needed to produce seed, and that's a recent shot of the seed production area at David's property at Chatsworth. One of David's crops of wallaby grass. A lot of the initial seed for the restoration was actually harvested from the original 2013 restoration, and that's a model which would be very useful to use in future, where we roll over from one sowing to the next. You'd have to supplement with diversity, but that is one of the techniques to consider for expanding this on a larger scale. The site was, as I said, scalped by the road constructors for the Dundonald wind farm, and that was done in autumn. It was done in the last 2 or 3 hours before the autumn break, in fact. So it was a bit of a rush, and there was a certain weed component left on that site, which will continue to be a bit of an issue, but it'll settle down over the years. Now, that was direct sown, and I'm just showing here this process. That's David operating his tractor and home built seeder. You can see the wind blower. It's a forced air seeder, and as we move past, you can see also the operation of these tines. Now, this was originally the machine here was originally a turf renovator, and Paul Gibson-Roy in his initial work on this incorporated this type of machine into the large-scale direct sowing. Those tines oscillate and they create this nice broken seed bed, which provides little divots where our seed tends to settle. And so initially, although it's a direct sown site, initially you seem to have a sort of a row and column look to it because of these divots that are formed by the tines. This is the seed mix we're using, and here's David loading the seed mix into the machine. You can see it's a very fluffy seed mix, so we don't clean down to pure seed. That's something that allows us then to work very efficiently with the seed. Once the seed was designed, sorry, that wasn't supposed to happen. We'll just go back there. You can run through these things many times and still mess it up on the occasion. See the seed in the hopper there. And that's the result. So now, given we've had a very good season for it, so it has been a wetter than usual season since that sowing in October last year, but it has produced a fantastic result for us. There's a little bit of phalaris in there that would have gone in with the original seed lot. There are some crop weeds still there, but it's a wonderful covering of Anthonia, or sorry, wallaby grass, some spear grass, lots and lots of forbs are down in there as well. Now, the second set of questions was with the experimental aspects of the project, and that was a matter of determining a few key questions. Now, can an existing restoration be enhanced by supplementary planting? Now, we're direct sowers, we're direct seeders, but supplementary planting may have a role where you want to include large populations of plants which don't necessarily respond well to direct sowing. So, experiment one was of selected forbs from tube stock planting, re-sowing the site. So we scalped again within the 2013 site and re-sowed, and then we also introduced some plantings of Themata tube stock, of kangaroo grass tube stock to see if we could again get that species, the dominant species for this vegetation system, back on the site quicker. Now, the other question was, does the season of planting or sowing affect the establishment of and survival in, therefore we planted in autumn and spring, and we did that over 2 years. So there were in fact 4 plantings, autumn and spring in 2018, autumn and spring in 2019. That's the experimental area within the 2013 site. So it's an established, by now it's an established native sward, and we've then imposed the experimental treatments on there. And this, if this is successful, it has wider applications for enhancing existing remnants, possibly, and for maybe staging restoration of some of these sites. For instance, this is the wonderful yam daisy, Murnong, Microcereus walteri. We've rediscovered, I mean, it's always been there, but we've managed to find it on the Woorndoo-Streatham Road and also the Bowlock Plains Road, which runs in and joins the Woorndoo-Streatham Road just near our site. So we have a seed source for that species now, and we'd love to incorporate that in much larger numbers, and that might be best achieved by planting. But orchids, all sorts of other species which don't respond all that well to direct sowing or are slow under direct sowing circumstances, possibly on a targeted, you could target reintroductions through So the experiment, I'm only going to concentrate on one experiment here today, but 9 species, so 9 forb species by 2 planting treatments by 2 seasons and over 2 years. And there were 9 plants, so the 9 plants per planting block, which was the smallest experimental unit. The treatments were either 9 plants together of the same species, or mix of 9 plants in a single block, just to see whether they seem to establish better under one or other situation. You can imagine there might be some competition set up between species in this second treatment. The experiment was replicated 5 times, which meant we planted in total 2,700 plants in this experiment. All plantings were monitored regularly and to keep track of the progress of each species. That's the experimental design. That's just one replication. So this continued on 5 replications down the block. Treatment 1. So this was an experimental block unit. So the smallest unit here, and then it was surrounded by established sward. So this was just sprayed out, and we planted in that small sprayed out area. So 1, 2, 3, 4 seasons. These are the other experiments which were laid out on the same basic site. So that's what an experimental block looked like, experimental treatment looked like prior to sowing, prior to planting. Getting my tongue tied. We used in this case a drill, an auger and a drill, which created some interesting issues. I asked that we do this rather than a Hamilton planter because we wanted to be able to plant in at a specific time, and was not absolutely sure that the soil conditions would be suitable for a Hamilton planter at that time. So we used that uniformly across all experiments. There's a planting crew working on the site during the planting, one of the seasonal plantings. That's what a seasonal planting looked like after the job was done. So this is treatment, this is the first season, and you can see here the forbs planted out in their prescribed blocks. Wide variation in responses. We had for some very successful species and some that didn't go so well. The successful ones seemed to have in common that they had a strong root system and filled the tube well, and they have wide environmental tolerances. This middle group, pale everlasting, which should do very well, featherheads, button wrinklewort, they need a bit more work. But what I noticed in monitoring was that they were very good in some blocks and not so good in others. So we need to look more closely at that. The other ones, the blushing bindweed, billy buttons and glycine, they all had in common that they had a relatively weak root system, or not so much the billy buttons, but the other two have a relatively weak root system within the tube, and I think they're falling apart at planting to some extent. That's what a plot looks like these days. An example of a flowering billy button, just to make it easier for me to find them. But I have to find 9 plants within that sward these days. Interesting process. Some very quick preliminary results. For the all species together or all species mixed, there appears to be no substantial difference across the all. If we take account of all species, there appears to be no substantial difference in what format they're planted in. Although we might expect to see some changes in treatment 2 as individual species become more dominant within those plots, remembering that they're the mixed plots. So over time, and I think the value of this experiment will be into the future, we'll see whether that number alters. Autumn and spring, across all species, no apparent difference, but when we look at individual species in more detail, we may find that there is some useful information come out of that. And again, the years, 2019 looks better than 2018, but you've got to remember, of course, that this is more recently planted, so they've had, as I say in the classics, less time to die. Now, the community engagement aspects of it. We've been developing seed production area, preparing tube stock, field seed collection, and supporting our annual community days. And I do thank the volunteers. A typical example of a volunteer day working on plants in David's nursery. Neville Walsh presenting at our last community day in November last year, a wonderful day where over 100 people attended. Neville Walsh and David Franklin, two heroes of grassland restoration. Neville as the guiding botanist and David, of course, as the technologist. He's worked with Paul Gibson right from the very start. Just to
one minute, John.
Yeah, thank you. Just to finish up now, I think we've got some things to recognise here. I think we've got to find ways of incorporating a wider range of cultural views into this, both traditional owners and the community itself. In my view, this is a proven concept for the types of restoration that we're doing, and Paul will speak more on that issue later today. The next frontiers, I think that moving on from direct sowing into large areas, there's also the reconstruction, reconnection, repair of existing remnants and getting them back together again with each other between along corridors. And Lincoln, Amy and John will all speak to that topic in various forms today. There's a massive opportunity for development of activity. For young people to be involved in this activity, I think we have to find professional pathways for them. We can't expect them to volunteer on a regular basis. They have busy lives, they have careers to develop, and I think we've got to develop a professional opportunity for them, and that may also be an opportunity for rural and regional businesses like seed production and restoration activities, vegetation management. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for that, John. Now, there are a lot of questions, but we need to keep moving at the beginning. Maybe I'll get you just to answer one question for us, John. You mentioned the wind farm. Have they, is there any long-term plans for helping out, supporting this project?
There is a community fund, and I believe that local community. Sorry, I'm getting an echo here at the moment. Are you getting that echo, Amy?
A little bit. Okay. And I might just say, Lincoln, could you start to get your presentation ready, please?
So there is a community fund, and we have local representatives on the committee that manages that fund, I understand. So yes, there is potential there for some further help from them in the future.
Right, thank you. Yeah, I'm getting echo. Now, John, if you could stop sharing your screen, please. Thank you very much. And everyone, there will be opportunity for questions. So I'm trying to get your questions in the chat, keeping in mind I don't have all the answers by far. But we will get back to them later on. So now, while Lincoln Kern, our next speaker, is going to talk to us about the sides for conservation and repair, while Lincoln's getting his presentation up, I'll just read a little bit about Lincoln. So Lincoln was trained in botany and environmental science in the United States and has been working in the environmental field in Victoria on a full-time basis since 1991. Lincoln has run Practical Ecology since 1993, offering an integrated service for managers of native vegetation and developers as required. He has been providing expertise in flora and fauna surveys, environmental planning, bushland restoration, environmental and noxious weed control, revegetation and general land management services since 1993. He sees his mission as a consultant and company as helping land managers and planners. Please, could someone, I'm just going to mute everyone. Lincoln, you'll need to unmute yourself. Okay. Sorry, I was getting some background noise there. He sees his mission as a consultant and company as helping land managers and planners, whether in government authorities or as private citizens, to detect, to protect and manage Indigenous flora and fauna, and to provide a wide range of consulting and contracting services to meet conservation land management objectives. Wow, that's big. Okay, Lincoln, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you. Lincoln, if you unmute yourself, and you've got 10 minutes. Thanks.
No worries. Thank you, Aggie. Now, hopefully my sharing is straightforward. Can you all see that?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. So I'm going to introduce, just do a very quick overview of some mapping we did of the Woorndoo-Chatsworth Road to the west of Woorndoo. That beginning photo illustrates some of the good quality grassland that is present on that road. Basically, I'll address 6 different topics: an introduction to the Woorndoo-Chatsworth Road, introduction to the plains, grassy, woodland, and grassland of sorts that occurs along the road, our mapping methodology, and then talk about in effect, what I ended up doing was documenting how the local CFA brigade has managed that roadside for grassland conservation for the last few years or decades, and then a little bit of reflection on how good that practice has been, but also how some small problems with the practices. So here's a picture of the territory. Woorndoo-Chatsworth Road is a 3-chain road reserve extending from Woorndoo to Chatsworth. The western end is down in a little creek valley, and that has been more extensively disturbed over time. But you can see the long stretches up on the flat plains, and also you can see from this aerial photo many red gums left in some of the paddocks. So this was really territory of plains, grassy, woodland before settlement. This is a map of the pre-settlement EVCs, ecological vegetation classes, and you can see the description there indicating the abundance of eucalyptus, the tree canopy being typically Comadulensis, and then different life forms. But what's worth pointing out here is that it began as plains, grassy, woodland, but it's been modified over time, in which the elements have been separated. So you got lots of magnificent old red gums along the road. To the left is one there with giant hollows and so on, and these are actually pretty typical. There's maybe dozens to hundreds, over 100 of these large red gums, and they're conserved quite well. But also good areas of native grassland where with lots of daisies like the chrysocephalum you can see from a distance, but good variety in among the grassland patches that remain. Our mapping methodology was pretty straightforward, basically a variation of the roadside vegetation condition mapping used since the 90s in Victoria, but dividing up the medium into 2 categories because I've never quite liked the medium just being in the middle. I adopted this kind of approach of 4 levels many years ago because it seemed to make more sense to me. But what was also true was there's patches of overstory trees with exotic pasture grasses were abundant, and I'll get back to that. We basically separated out all the blocks with it by doing GPS unit, using a handheld GPS unit to map the different quality zones. What we identified was there's large blocks of treeless plains, grassy, woodland with a moderate to high quality condition because of regular burning and biomass reduction. And I'll highlight here, they're essentially grassland as you might know it when you look at it, but it is plains, grassy, woodland without the trees in another sense, in another technical sense. In among these big blocks of plains, grassy, woodland are islands of red gums and other indigenous trees, separated by plowed firebreaks and usually surrounded by exotic pasture grasses. And I was able to basically map. It's a demonstration of effective and reasonably efficient approach to managing fuel loads and flora diversity. So here's our maps. You can see the key to the right. The orange bits are the lower quality, but you can see that heaps of the roadside are high and medium high, and the red patches are the little bits of red gum where typically there's phalaris underneath them, but they're quite limited in extent. So this is the east end, the west end down near Chatsworth. And a lot of the roadside's in very good condition. And as the next maps indicate as well, next one further along, again, most of the roadside's in excellent condition, but there are stands of red gums in among the red on these maps, where the phalaris and exotic pasture grasses are extensive underneath those. I've got some pictures to illustrate this very shortly. So that's the third map. You can see this is towards almost towards the middle, and this section is short on red gums, but very high on good quality grassland. And that's the fourth one I have for today. There's a couple more maps not yet finished to get all the way to Woorndoo, but this stretch of the road is quite good quality as well.
2 minutes, please, Lincoln.
No worries. So essentially what they do is, I think I've explained this pretty well. They plow firebreaks between the islands of trees and through the red gums. And here's some pictures to illustrate those. You can see a road is an excellent firebreak. The plowed firebreaks along the fences are also really useful. And these just show different examples of the system that's been established. And it's very efficient and effective, apparently, when it comes to implementation. You can see on the right, we've got one of the big red gums again, but a good patch of native grassland with a few trees, or plains grassy woodland. These illustrate it too. You can see on the left, big patches of kangaroo grass and the big red gums, and on the right, the phalaris under the red gums and the stipa in among the grassland along the road, all separated by the firebreaks. So maybe I'm done sooner than later. What I was able to do in this small project was document a fairly successful and practical approach to manage native grassland and implement a strategic firebreak along a rural road reserve. And hopefully it's suitable to inspire efforts elsewhere, similar efforts, because biomass reduction is really important in plains grassy woodlands or grassland ecosystems, as we'll hear from others today. It isn't an excellent picture because it's a lot of territory and there are some problems that aren't being addressed. The islands of exotic grasses on the trees that in some circumstances might burn and catch the trees on fire. So there's some issues here to address. But otherwise, burning is effectively done very efficiently. But targeted follow-up weed control is needed, and I'm understanding that some has been done over the last couple of years. So that's good to hear. Also, another small problem is of the approach is making sure the plowed firebreaks stay contained and limited as much as possible. So that's my 10 minutes, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Lincoln.
No worries.
And look, there, as I keep letting people know, we've got a bit of time set aside later on in the agenda for questions, but we will move right along. So I'll ask if you can stop sharing your screen so Amy Jackson can start setting hers up.
Yes, thank you.
But yeah, that's fantastic to see the results of your findings so far, Lincoln. I think everyone will agree. So now while Amy is getting her, she's got a quick little video she's made and going to take us through. So Amy works for the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, DELP, I'll just say. And Amy studied and worked on a variety of environmental projects on the VVP over the last 18 years. She has a particular interest in managing and enhancing significant vegetation communities, such as the Western Basalt Plains grasslands, stony rise woodlands and salt marsh vegetation in the Western District lakes. For the last 3 years, Amy's been working on the Linear Reserves project with a wide range of stakeholders, aiming to raise awareness of the importance of native grasslands, managing invasive weeds and reinstating appropriate burning regimes. So I will hand over to Amy, who's going to show us an introduction to native grasslands, a video presentation. Thank you, Amy.
Thanks, Aggie. We developed this short video presentation for the Linear Reserves project to get the grasslands message out to a wider audience than those who would already have an interest in grasslands and would be likely to attend an event such as this. So it's aimed at CFA volunteers. It's short, it's a 6-minute video, and it's designed to be included in existing online meetings or training. But it would also be good for other crews like council work crews or contractors or anyone who's doing work on roadsides and doesn't have previous botanical experience. And as we know, they're working in some pretty sensitive environments, so this could help prevent some potential damage. We haven't distributed this video yet, but we'll be working with CFA veg management officers to get it out there to groups. And if you think you've got a group that would benefit from seeing it, then you can get in contact with me. So I'll just let it play through now. Welcome to this short video about native grasslands. This presentation has been developed with the purpose of providing a basic introduction on native grasslands, how to identify them, why they are so significant, and the benefits of regular planned burning. My name is Amy Jackson. I work for the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, and I'm currently working on the department's Native Grassland Linear Reserves project. The vegetation type we are referring to is the natural temperate grasslands of the Victorian volcanic plains. This map shows the area which the VVP bioregion covers, and within that, the green shading represents the remaining grassy eucalypt woodland vegetation, and the yellow shading represents the natural temperate grasslands. Native grasslands and grassy woodlands once covered approximately 2.3 million hectares, extending from Melbourne west to near the South Australian border. Today, less than 1% of remnant natural temperate grasslands remain on the VVP. They are listed as a critically endangered vegetation type, and they're protected by the state government's Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act and the Commonwealth Government's Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. Most of the native grasslands remaining on Crown land are confined to small isolated linear patches, mainly on roadsides and rail reserves. The photo on the left is an example of introduced grasses, dominated by phalaris and other exotic pasture grasses. The vegetation is high in biomass, highly flammable and high fire risk. Compared to the photo on the right, which is an example of a native grassland. It's dominated by kangaroo grass and species which remain greener in summer. It has a lower biomass and poses a lower fire risk. During the event of a fire, this would have a much lower intensity and a lower flame height. Grassland identification. Native grasslands are not just grasses. They include a diverse range of herbs and wildflowers and provide habitat for mammals, reptiles and insects. They flower in the spring and through into the summer, and during the colder months when flowers are dormant, native grasslands can be more difficult to identify. Grassland identification. Roadside signage is present at some native grassland sites, but not all. Look for the distinctive rust-coloured kangaroo grass to indicate the presence of a native grassland. Any kind of disturbance, such as driving on, ploughing, inappropriate spraying or inappropriate grazing, can have devastating negative effects on the condition of native grasslands. Always contact the land manager for advice before doing any disturbance works. Grasslands and the benefits of burning. Fire is a critical aspect of grasslands management. Many of the best examples of high-quality native grasslands occur on roadsides that are regularly burnt by CFA brigades. Without the ongoing commitment of CFA volunteers, these areas would decline in quality and diversity. Planned burning on grassland roadsides is ideally conducted on average every 2 to 3 years in the late summer and autumn period. Burning at any time of the year is preferable to not burning at all. However, later season burning allows native species to set seed. The benefits of burning in grasslands includes reducing fuel loads, reducing weed loads, maintaining the overall health of the grassland, and stimulating germination of native species and diversity of native species. It also has the added benefit of increasing visibility and traffic safety for road users. In terms of grassland management, DELP's Linear Reserves project is working with CFA to help facilitate ongoing planned burning at the appropriate timing and frequency. The project is carrying out follow-up weed control on recently burnt sites. If we're able to determine the sites which have been recently burnt, then the two management actions can work really well together, as recently burnt sites are safer, easier and quicker for contractors to access and work in. Less herbicide is required and there is less risk of off-target damage to native plant species. On behalf of DELP, I'd like to thank all CFA volunteers and staff for their ongoing commitment to protecting communities and managing native grasslands. If you'd like further information on grasslands or the Linear Reserves project, please contact me on the email listed here, amy.jackson@delp.vic.gov.au. Thank you. That's all, folks. Thanks.
That was fantastic, Amy. Thank you. And now this has sparked a lot of interest. If people are looking at the chat, there's a lot of people wondering how they can get access to this. So we're already talking about seeing if we can put it on the VVP CMN site and Swift, and also DELP website, possibly in the CMA website too. But we'll certainly, now I've got everyone's contact, so we'll certainly, anything coming out of this meeting, obviously pursuant to presenters being happy to share, we'll certainly be getting stuff out to everyone. So now that brings us to a quick sort of 10-minute break, or we're now down to an 8-minute break. So this is your chance to go to the toilet, grab a cuppa, grab something to eat, and be back at your screens, please, for John Morgan to do his presentation starting at 11:05. But also feel free to hang around and unmute yourselves and have a chat. I know John certainly is saying to just chat. This might also be a good time for any of those unanswered questions to see if you can have a chat now. So I'll be staying online too. But yes, you've got free time for 7 minutes now.
Thanks, Aggie. Good to have you in charge.
Now I see, I'm not sure if Anthony has stayed online or not, but Anthony's asked, is there a downside to a late winter cool burn, e.g. near sundown? Now, I assume you mean, are you on, Anthony? If you are, if you can unmute yourself.
Yes, yep.
Yeah. So you're talking late winter and not late autumn, Anthony?
Yeah, often say late July. There's often a period where Polaris and things like that are quite dead. You know, the old tall growth, and if you have a burn at that time, the green doesn't burn at all and is not affected, but the dead stuff gets burnt away. So I'd like to explore the usefulness of that for improving the native mix.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if anyone listening has got an answer to that. I certainly know that we're looking at not so much late winter burns, but more late autumn burns. I suppose once you get past the break, there's obviously just the risk of burning the lilies that have started to come up, especially. But if it's a one-off, often, you know, sort of a late winter burn is good for getting your sweet vernal and your annual exotics. But I'm sure there's far more qualified people here to answer that one. If I know John Morgan especially has talked a bit about this. And I see Amy's just responding to that question too. I might. So I think we might all sort of put our heads together and think about that, but that's certainly something to think about, because CFA brigades, certainly with some research we're currently doing at the moment, trying to work out why, roadsides are getting burnt less and less, and we have a fair idea it's because of lack of resources, and also we know that people don't like getting on trucks in sort of high summer when it's very high fire danger, and we're certainly looking at, well, can we push burning back? So one, it's getting out of farmers' busy harvesting times, and it's not such a massive risk, but where we're not going to damage the grasslands. So but I think, yeah, there's a lot of conversations, chats coming up with this one. I might now, someone did just have their hand up, and I was about to, so whoever it was that had your hand up, if you want to put your hand up again, please do. Anthony, can you see all the chat coming up?
Yeah, that's really good. Just have to work out how to save it. Or they disappear. Thank you. I'll just say the reason why I'm attracted to this late winter burning is that the fire moves at slower than walking speed, and if you got the wind right, and you can do it on your own, so you don't need a brigade or a group to do it. So.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's certainly something that we need to think about, isn't it?
Aggie, can I just jump in for a moment?
Yes, sure, John.
I don't know whether John Morgan's listening at the moment, and he'll possibly have a chance to. He's done a lot of this. I don't claim to understand the dynamics of this well, but I do recognise that we've got a lot to do in terms of managing, particularly the invasive pasture grasses, and I think it should all be on the table, and sensible discussions about that. But in my observation, that one autumn burn is not sufficient to keep the Polaris in particular. It's great for the grasslands. That's probably all they need. But where you have Polaris involved in the system, it seems that you need another intervention at some stage, and obviously that intervention has to be judged depending on how much damage you're likely to do to native grassland adjacent or within. But there's a huge conversation to be had about how we manage these very robust and productive pasture grasses on these roadsides, because at the moment it's not. I don't believe it's working at the moment. There seems to be a need for a second intervention if we're going to maintain Polaris at a safe level or even reduce its influence.
I might just add, Aggie, it's John Morgan here. Thanks for that question, Anthony. It always gets down to what's your objective. So winter burning is really detrimental to some species, because in autumn, when they start regrowing, they're pushing all their, I'll use a technical term, their carbohydrate, their food energy resources from below ground, they're pushing it above ground, and so hence they're really vulnerable to being burnt at that time. But a fire at that time might be superb for knocking back exotic annual grasses. If you've got a large quaking grass issue through your grassland, then maybe one fire at that time will be superb for, reducing the weed load. So it really does get down to purpose. And so I don't think we need to be prescriptive about yes or no. It would get down to what's the objective and what are you trying to do in your grassland.
Thanks for that, John. Have we got any more burning questions before, because maybe, John, you could be getting if you want to get your presentation up and ready to go. I will read a little bit about you now, but we did tell people they had till 11:05. So is there any really quick question? Just jump in if you have a really burning question. Pardon the pun. And if not, no? Okay, all righty. Well, while John is getting his presentation up and ready, I'll just read a little bit for anyone who possibly doesn't know about John. I find that hard to believe, but I'll read this just in case. So, Associate Professor John Morgan is a passionate advocate for grassland conservation, management and restoration. From the tiny plants to the dominant grasses, he has championed their importance and beauty for nearly 30 years. He's pragmatic too. Grasslands might be small and often weedy, but John has focused on the mantra, to recover the ecosystem, first you have to save all the parts. To do that, he has studied the germination of species, detailed how long plants live, measured their response to fire, and looked at ways to recover the connections that make grasslands tick. Most importantly, he works to bring the local community along for the ride. So John is going to present to us on looking to the future, where should we be focusing our efforts for grassy ecosystem conservation and restoration. So over to you, John.
Thanks, Aggie. And you can see my screen okay?
Yep, perfect.
Thank you. And thank you for that lovely introduction and also the talks we've had earlier this morning. I'm speaking from Wurundjeri country, but specifically from my car, so I'm hoping the connection will hold up for you today. I want to get you to think a little bit today, and I'm happy if you disagree with me. I want to challenge you, but I think we need to think about, what does the next 20 years look like? Okay. Sorry, it's just not going forward for me. There we go. There we go. So the plains grasslands, as we know, very diverse, and Amy's done a lovely introduction to that. But just to put it into some context, for plant species at least anyway, they're really important because they hold about a third of Victoria's plants. And around 100 of those are grass species, and we tend to forget about those. We tend not to put lots of photos up about grasses. Since 1986, the Victorian Volcanic Plains has been a really important area, hotspot as it were, for identifying new species. And last year at this event, Neville Walsh talked about the fact that 39 new species had been identified that seemed to be endemic to the Victorian Volcanic Plains. So in a biological sense, they're really, really important, and their conservation is crucial. We know most of it's been lost, and we don't need to harp on that. That's the big conservation challenge. The best bits are typically in public land on roadsides, but there's a lot of this vegetation in private hands. And so it's, how do we get to manage both aspects and improve those remnants that perhaps aren't in great condition? That's the challenge. How many species have we lost from the Victorian Volcanic Plains? I'll get you just to think of a number. Out of that 900, how many do you think have been lost from this system? Hopefully you've got a number in mind. Well, the numbers depend on what you're asking. If you're talking about global extinction of a species that is on the Victorian Volcanic Plain, well, it's none. One's very close to it, Diurus fragrantissima, which is the sunshine diurus, almost extinct in the wild. I'm happy for people to point out if they think these numbers aren't right. We do know of 2 species that are no longer found on the plains that are still found elsewhere in Victoria. That's the yellow eyebright, Euphrasia scabra, which is, as it turns out, a parasite, so it parasitises other plants, and Thesium australe, which was known to grow around places like Skipton back in the day. So at one level, despite all that habitat loss, we have an opportunity to conserve most of the flora because it still exists somewhere in the landscape. But should we get complacent? Well, short answer to that is no way, Jose. Some work by Ben Zeman, a PhD student of mine a few years ago, showed the dire state in which grasslands exist. This is a grassland occupancy map, how many species occur at each grassland site. And it's primarily confined to around Melbourne. You can see those areas in yellow. What I want you to take from this graph is that more than 110 grassland sites across Melbourne and Greater Melbourne and Outer Melbourne contain fewer than 5 native species. So the vast majority of grasslands were species poor. And you can see at the right-hand end of the graph, very few sites were species rich, meaning contain most of the species. So this has a real conservation concern here. If we lose some of those species rich sites, we lose most of the species from the plains. So we can't afford that. But the sites on the left-hand side suggest that these sites have probably degraded or lost species. And what can we do with those grasslands rather than just write them off? Because they're the vast majority of sites. They're species poor. And so the work that John Delpratt and others and Paul Gibson-Roy, who will talk after me, have been doing is thinking about how do you enhance diversity. Really critical work. Now I'm going to walk you through a couple of ideas here. If we think of this grassland here as the whole of the Victorian volcanic plain, so 250 years ago, it stretched from Melbourne down towards the South Australian border. What's obviously happened is we've lost habitat and it's become smaller and smaller and smaller through time. So we can represent that by a series of declining boxes. So it's sort of sensible that we would therefore have fewer species in our grasslands based on their area, their size. So maybe one thing that's going on is that just most of our grasslands are really small and don't support many species. But inappropriate management probably has also contributed to this. Now, as a biologist, we really worry about this idea. If we think about the number of species, so our y-axis here is how many species persist in a landscape. There's been some nice work done all over the globe in grasslands that show we would expect to see species decline or be lost from grasslands as we lose more and more of their habitat. So that's the line that you can see. So at 100% of habitat, you've got 100% of species. And as you get down to 40% of habitat, you might have 75% of species still present and so on. Now, what's really, really interesting is when people went out and looked for the number of species persisting in various locations in grasslands primarily all over the globe, they found this really interesting relationship that most sites, whether they be the black triangles here or the crosses here, sit above the line. So what that means is despite the fact we've lost lots of habitat, most habitats or most grasslands are maintaining more species than we would on the evidence of available habitat. And that's what we're seeing on the Victorian volcanic plains. But let's not get complacent here. This particular little doozy over here is the grassland part of the study that was done in Melbourne. And so you can see Melbourne has lost most of its grasslands, probably about 90%, 95%. We don't need to quibble about the numbers. And yet we've maintained, of the known species that were in these grasslands around Melbourne, about 95% of the species. But what that says is, over time, we might expect to lose, if we lost no more grasslands, and we know that's not true, if we lost no more grasslands, perhaps species will start to drop out of these systems and eventually head down towards that line. That's the predicted number of species at that habitat proportion. So shockingly, we expect to lose 44% more species, or perhaps over 500 species in coming decades or centuries. And this is a concept called the extinction debt. Species are hanging around, but ultimately go extinct as they dwindle away. And perhaps that process has already started. So that's a really key challenge for us to think about how do we manage grasslands to ensure, A, we can prevent this from happening, but we actually improve the proportion or the area of grassland in which these species can persist. That gives us a bit of hope, actually. Perhaps it's not too late. We've still got most of the species. We've lost most of the habitat. We've been talking about that for a long period of time. So what the hell are we going to do to prevent this from happening? That becomes the crux of the question. So clearly we need to enhance protection of these areas, and we've been doing a lot of that work over the last 30 years. That includes identifying sites, putting fences up, getting inappropriate disturbances out, things such as four-wheel driving and stuff like that. We've got to manage these sites. They've got weeds, they've got fire requirements, they've got all sorts of landscape context problems, whether that be urban or agricultural areas. So we've got to manage them. We know that. And I see in the chat box, how we do that still needs to be expressed to many people. We've got opportunities for restoration. And so Paul Gibson-Roy, speaking after me, has pioneered with John Delpratt how to restore grasslands from scratch. But what I want to talk about today is what else should we be thinking about? What have we either not got on the radar? What have we forgotten about? What should we actually do? I'm going to start in a really curious place, probably one that you wouldn't think. I've got 5 things I want to cover. And so the first one is a focus on the inch flora. And you'll see why in a moment. Now, if you don't know what I mean, that's because you're too young to know what an inch is. We're talking small plants, maybe 2.5 centimetres tall or less, an inch. And so here we've got a fantastic example of one of those inch flora called Hyalosperma demissum from the daisy family. Isn't it gorgeous? Now, annual plants have some really big challenges in life. And I just want to touch briefly on what those challenges are. Now, I'm going to use a non-local example. This is a little annual plant that happens to inhabit waterways. But if you think about it, they're tiny. So we don't see them, obviously. But biologically, that means they've got lots of stresses. They've got to compete with lots of bigger plants. They don't weigh much. So how the hell do they make a living? As I said, they're tiny. If you know what a mountain ash is, the world's tallest flowering plant, which occurs in the Dandenongs, just up the road from me, they're 165,000 times shorter. That's going to put you at some disadvantage. And if you compare them next to a giant redwood, we all know what they are, they're 7 trillion times lighter in mass. So you think, wow, these plants have some real disadvantages here. So why is this important for Victorian volcanic plains? Well, on the VVP, there's a whole range of plants that are both beautiful in their own right, but also easy to overlook. So I'm just going to go through a few of them. If they're new to you, that's great. That means that we don't have them on our radar at all. This one here used to occur at Skipton, near the Skipton Common. Don't think it does anymore. Isn't this fantastic? You might be aware of the trigger plants, the perennial ones that we've all gone along and triggered to get them to shoot. Well, you get annuals. Here's Stylidium dyspectum. Fantastic thing, isn't it? Gorgeous. Another little daisy. This one does hang around a little bit more, possibly because it's a touch bigger than most annuals. Triptylodiscus pygmaeus. It's funny, pygmaeus meaning small. It's actually the biggest of the annuals. So really, these plants do have a bit of a challenge. One of my favourite groups, the Centralepis group. Here's a little hairy one here called Strigosa. Look at this, Leavenhookia. This is related to those trigger plants. It just doesn't have the trigger. Fantastic little thing. Now, if you've seen any plants growing across the VVP, all good for you because they're actually really rare now. Indeed, almost all of them have disappeared across most of their range of the Victorian volcanic plains. And we did a survey just recently thinking about the species we knew of on the VVP, and that comes from observations of early botanists by Sutton and Patton back 100 years ago or more. And we put our heads together and our collective survey inventories together, and we decided we hadn't seen 16 species of these annuals on the VVP, which is almost half of them, for at least multiple decades. Have they already gone locally extinct across the plains? So the reason I draw your attention to this is I think we need to get serious about species conservation. Grasslands as an ecosystem are highly threatened, but it's the species in them that actually contribute to why these things are important. And Aggie's already sold my line here. If we want to save this ecosystem, we need to get serious about saving all the parts. And this annual example is one where it's not been on our radar at all, and we're losing a whole bunch of species. So I come to my second point about what should we be thinking about, and it links beautifully to the annual story, because we have to ask, well, why have annuals gone missing? And I think it's got something to do with the fact there are missing elements to the function of grasslands that we've not really spent much time thinking about. These are hard challenges, of course, so I'm not suggesting that these are going to be things that we can switch overnight. So what do I mean about function? Well, here's a little cute animal that you find on the Victorian volcanic plain. It's a fat-tailed dunnart. And if you didn't know, dunnarts are carnivores. They're aggressive little beasts. They've got big teeth. They hunt things. If you're having trouble thinking about this as a predator, think of wolves, as it's an equivalent to a wolf in a different ecosystem. So they prey on items below them, obviously, and those things below them eat things, and the things below them eat things. They're part of a food chain. These species are probably the biggest carnivore, well, they are the biggest carnivore that's native at least, across the Victorian volcanic plains. You can find them under roof tiles, they're seeking refuge, so we need to know how to manage them. But I want to think about another group of animals that contribute to function. And that's the digging animals that were really, really common across the grasslands of southeastern Australia and elsewhere going into the arid country. So things such as bandicoots, eastern bar bandicoots in particular in Western Victoria, but they would have been bettongs, they've all the little digging animals that have gone largely extinct because of cats and foxes and habitat loss. These animals are really, really important because they dig the soil and create opportunities for renewal. They create disturbances that some species seem to need for germination, perhaps a lot of those annuals in particular, but a whole bunch of others we don't really understand. And you can see in this example, which clearly is not taken from the VVP, that's a sandy soil, a little digging by a small animal has allowed 3 or 4 germinating seeds there to start coming up. They look like they even could be acacia from that. So it suggests there's a role for digging. A beautiful essay just came out last week on highlighting this, and that's why I put it in actually, because Orshi Decker, who's a ex-PhD student at La Trobe University, did her PhD about Australia's native gardeners, these small animals that were digging up tubers, creating opportunities for renewal, putting litter back into the soils rather than blowing away or degrading or not even degrading. And so she talked about how the loss of the country's digging mammals compromises the continent's arid soil health. But I think she missed the opportunity to talk about the loss of these system drivers for generating opportunities for regeneration in grasslands. And so you can go into grasslands and you can see this kind of activity. We see diggings, we see breaking up of soil plant canopies, these little foraging pits that then can trap nutrients and water and become microsites for germination. Now we're just starting to put some of these animals back into ecosystems. Predator-proof fences have proved pretty important. But if we're going to be serious about trying to restore grasslands, we need to think about, not so much obviously on roadsides, on the high quality sites, because it'll probably be a bit challenging, but restoring larger public and private land blocks, maybe animals play a really critical role. And we're doing wonders for their conservation as well. And so some wonderful work near Woorndoo, Tiverton, is doing exactly this. They're just about to put back bandicoots into their native grasslands, and hopefully this will start a whole chain of ecological functioning that improves outcomes for native species. But I don't want us to forget about perennial native grasses. In Victoria, we have 64 genera and close to 400 species of native grasses. Most of us focus on kangaroo grass, tussock grasses, wallaby grasses and spear grasses, and probably wouldn't know many others beyond that. And that's okay. They are the big groups. But perennials are really important in grasslands because they provide structural integrity and persistence elements from year to year, meaning that because they're perennial, the tussock structure is there from year to year, and it provides some degree of stability to that ecosystem. Some of the most invaded grasslands that I know of have lost most of their perennial tussock grasses, and hence all that free water, all that free nutrients is being soaked up by a whole range of exotic annual grasses like oatgrass, ryegrass, quaking grasses. And so some of those ecosystems need to be pushed back into a more perennial system to maintain what I call stability. That from year to year, they don't change nearly as dramatically and drastically in a functional sense. We've really not thought much about this at all. In many cases, we want to knock back the native grasses to allow all the other species to persist. But the perennials are there the whole time, sucking up nutrients and using water. My third, before I get to that, I'm going to just have a little tiny rant just for 1 minute. Why function matters is because the EPBC Act, our premier environmental legislation in Australia, and the FFG Act in Victoria, the premier environmental legislation in Victoria, is pretty much silent on function. These acts typically emphasise threatened species as entities, and that's important. We want to save the species, but rarely do we talk about them as part of functioning ecosystems. So therefore, any concept such as web of life enhancing processes is completely absent from the legislation. So therefore, we symptom chase. We look one species at a time. How do we get that species to persist? Without thinking about, well, where does it fit in a functional ecosystem? By doing this, bandicoots are a classic one. We can save the species, but it's going to have all these great benefits to ecosystem function. How does that fit for other species? So interactions and interrelationships between species, that's what ecology is what runs ecosystems and allows them to evolve. Currently, legislation is silent on this pretty critical issue. So it's beholden upon us to push function as a really important reason for recovery and restoration of grasslands, because it won't be pushed by anyone else at this point in time. Threatening processes will, threatening species will, but functional relationships is pretty much silent. So that's just a little rant from me. My third thing that I think we need to think a little bit more about is recovering woody species in grasslands. And it was great to hear Lincoln talk a little bit about the old growth trees around Woorndoo. Many of us would look at a grassland, and if it was in good condition, we'd visualize it like this. Open spaces, lots of diversity, kangaroo grass, fantastic. Absolutely. But much of the landscape was, in part, treed. Not the whole landscape, but there were select parts of the landscape. So this is from the Challicum sketchbook by Cooper in 1852 up near Langigaran, near Challicum. And we can see scattered tree cover in this landscape, probably she oaks, I'm guessing, and around the wetter areas, red gums. And another view is almost of this very scattered tree cover, almost savanna-like. Why that's important is because we've lost most of that tree cover, which is plays a critical role in floral and other food resources for a bunch of birds and animals, arboreal animals, but also for a bunch of invertebrates. CSIROs determined from one tree, over 400 invertebrates might live on a single tree species, in this case, a eucalypt. So if you take out that important resource from a landscape, we're providing basically a desert for many of the species that run ecosystems. And we've got to start thinking about how might we do that. Now we see some evidence of these species still lurking in the landscape. So on stony rises, we still see perspectives such as a few shrubs sort of, clinging to existence. And over at Woorndoo, near Tiverton in particular, we've got beautiful tree violets and also sweet Bosseria on stony rises. These are probably quite old, many of these trees. So we've got to value them and think about where else might they need to be in the landscape if we're truly going to restore that landscape. In many cases, we've thought that woodies are not part of this system, but they clearly are. There's been some great work already done by the Friends of the Forgotten Woodlands. And if you're interested in this kind of stuff, please look online and see about joining up with them. But the Forgotten Woodlands is the woody part. So here we've got Banksia marginata, the tree form, and you can see these are on their last legs. We've got shea oaks in the background, and we've got Themata as an understory. So this grassland woodland probably would have been relatively continuous in its understory composition, but had important spatial distribution of the woodies. Now, obviously, this is an important species of Banksia because of the floral resources it provides to honeyeaters. How do they get through the landscape if we don't provide these kind of elements of the ecosystem? In some cases, these turn into absolute whopping great-grandfather type trees. Here's a Banksia. I mean, wouldn't ever expect Banksia to look like this. Don't know how old it is because it's very difficult to age. It's clearly very old based on the size of it. You can see someone about to put a tape measure around it, and I know when we did that, it came out at well around 2 meters in girth. Unfortunately, a year after this photo or so was taken, this plant died. Probably a bit of old age. It was looking very healthy at that point, but also probably either drought or some mixing of temperature. They seem a bit high temperature sort of sensitive in these landscapes. So this species has now, or sorry, this individual has died from this particular site, but thankfully there are a few seedlings that are now protected that will become the next generation. We need to do more of this to save both the species, to save the landscape, and to save the connectivity of that landscape. Speaking of connectivity, what a nice little segue. I think what we haven't done very well is think about what do we want this landscape to look like in 2050? And it's beholden on us to do this. Climates are changing. How are species going to move around landscapes? Where will they persist into the future? We need to be thinking about that in some respects. If we were just to stand back and look at an entire landscape, there's a whole bunch of things we might immediately think we could do. We should expand the area of existing grassland remnants. We might want to enhance the quality or the number of threatened species populations by appropriate targeted management. We might want to reduce the impact from surrounding environment. That could be perhaps, pulling down a sugar gum plantation that might be, sucking the moisture out of a grassland, for argument's sake. Or we might also think about increasing connectivity, because connectivity is what allows gene flow to occur. It also allows species to move through landscapes and hence that evolutionary process to continue. And that's how species will respond positively to things such as climate change, by ongoing evolution. Currently, this landscape is very limited in those options. So what should you do? Well, there's been some beautiful work done elsewhere in the state of Victoria, not in the Victorian volcanic plains, that say that when you've got really low cover vegetated landscapes, so less than 10% cover, the best thing you can do is put your revegetation or your restoration and think about the configuration, how it relates to other remnants. So improve connectivity. If you've already got 15 to 30% vegetation cover in your landscape, then probably enhancing patch area becomes the more critical thing. So connectivity, when you've got not much vegetation, has been thought to be one of the best things you can do. Improving that habitat area is probably more important when you've got, say, 15 to 30% vegetation cover. You need to do both, clearly, but we need to start thinking about what does this look like and can we map it out across the VVP. So a good example of that is grasslands around the Woorndoo area. So this is the Woorndoo-Streatham Road to the northeast of Woorndoo. And we've got really high quality grasslands that are segregated by really low quality grasslands. And this is likely to hamper species movements between those two patches. It's hostile environments. They can't get from one to the other. They don't like the habitat, or it's just impermeable to their movement. So that reduces pollination across those sites. That reduces seed dispersal and seedling establishment success. That might reduce animal movements. So it's a really big deal. But we've got these great remnants, which are probably of national significance, sitting a couple of 100 metres apart from one another. What should we do? Well, one of the things that we could do, and we're starting to think about doing, and with the CMA, where this is going to get off the ground very soon, so it's very exciting times, is to think about connecting those isolated patches, creating what might be called a corridor. But it doesn't have to be a corridor. It already exists as a corridor, so it's a habitat connection. I think we should push that idea. Why would we do this? Well, the Americans are a long way in front of us. They've been doing this for some time, and this fantastic paper came out a year or so ago that documented how creating habitat corridors in grassy ecosystems, which is really interesting, improved plant species diversity over time. So typically what happens is if you've got an isolated remnant, you don't do anything, you might manage it, but over time, in America at least, it lost species. And think back to that Melbourne example, we've got lots of small remnants that don't have many species in them. The likelihood is they're going to continue to lose species. But in their experiment, which has been running for some time, they connected up these isolated remnants and over time found that they actually gained species and they gained function. Pollination started improving. Seeds started dispersing between isolated patches through vectors, such as lizards, unbelievably. So there's a lot of good reasons why we should at least consider this. Will it work here? Well, like everything, we should try it and learn. If it doesn't, well, what have we lost? Just in terms of what they found, normally you would expect over time, you get outcomes of your connections increasing and then it sort of maxes out, so you'd expect that it would only have so much benefit. But in their 18-year study, they've just seen things getting better and better and better over time. So that's a really interesting finding in its own right, that by having done this, things have yet to level off. It's just been getting better and better and better. And I love their little sort of conclusion here that the benefits of corridors just keep compounding like interest in a bank account, helping damaged ecosystems rebuild themselves in ways they didn't understand were going to happen. So obviously connectivity is probably really critical in this landscape because most of the habitats is going to be hostile for native species. As Amy mentioned, we've got these added benefits of I'm getting feedback, Aggie.
Yeah, I'm just telling you 5 minutes, okay?
Oh, okay. I'm almost done, so that's good. Thank you. The added benefits might be you replace high fuel loads, Phalaris and those agricultural species, and you replace them with these lower biomass native species that burn quite differently. So there's actually really good reasons to do this, to replace the fuel hazards that exist out there and replace them with a lower hazard. Okay, my last point is thinking about larger habitats of native grasslands, which typically will be on private property. They've had a history of grazing or cultivation or whatever's gone on in the past. They've got some native species in them. That's where we've got to do a lot more work, is thinking about how to enhance species poor habitats, which might be quite large, and connecting them up with better remnants so we can start getting this function going. Now, we know not all grasslands look as spectacular as this roadside out the front of the Wycliffe Cemetery. Last spring, 2019, the sun orchids were going off on this particular day we were here, growing amongst the kangaroo grass. And we all aspire to these things and think, wow, isn't this great? And we've got to protect these, and absolutely we do. But then when we do go to some species poor sites, it's hard to get enthused about them in the same way. But that's because we're not thinking about their potential. The other thing we've got to remind ourselves is in many grasslands, the species that we've lost are like trees. They're not ephemeral. They're not just going to come back like weeds do. They actually take a bit of effort. So here's Tylotus macrocephalus. You can see it flowering there on the left. You might recognize it already. Below ground, it's like a tree trunk. You can see the above ground parts, the green leaves and the flower, that's the spent flower. It's all below ground. Once you lose that, that's incredibly difficult to get back overnight. So we need to think about how do we enhance those processes. Many native grassland species will be in a similar situation. We've lost these species because the history of their land use, it may well be grazing, and certainly in Western Victoria, merino sheep grazing as one of the predominant historical reasons for loss of species. And they pick out all the really juicy, palatable species. So they love daisies, they love orchids, they love certain species. And so we lose those. So a question might be, how do we get them back? Well, the first thing is probably need to take grazing off. It's not surprising that you don't get, too many structural or diversity outcomes when you graze like this. But is that enough? Well, perhaps we need to rethink how to rebuild those types of native grasslands. Paul here, who's going to talk next, has rebuilt grasslands from scratch, where we just get rid of all the weeds and we scalp and we put species back, and that's been incredibly successful. But what if you've already got a native grassland? It just doesn't have very many species. Do we really want to go back to that? It's a discussion we can have. Maybe though, what we can think about is changing the way we manage these grasslands. So we take stock off. That's probably not going to be great, because you're just going to get lots of grass growth, and that's going to smother out any species that were there. We currently don't have any animals there digging away, keeping it open. So we might have to think about reintegrating some type of fire, as is being done in this particular grassland, being burnt for the first time in 30 years. What might we expect? Well, time becomes really important. But what we might expect is slowly but surely species increase over time. So here's just some study I've been doing over near Dunkeld. We went from sheep grazing to burning every 1 or 2 years. You can see the blue is every year, red is every 2 years. And given the starting point, we're starting to see some improvements in the number of native species in this particular grassland. So slowly but surely, species can recover. In terms of, are these species yet dominating the grassland? Well, the answer to that's not really. They go up and down in relation to climate cycles, as you can see. Clearly there was a wet. More recently, it's been a bit drier, so the cover's quite low. So this is going to take time. But what we need to do is to start thinking about how do we get species back into these sites, and that's going to be seed biology. We're going to have to think about what species have no capacity to come back. Their seed banks don't exist. Their dispersal is too short distance to get you across this landscape to fortuitously land in a paddock. So we need to start working out how to get species back into grasslands. This is the great new frontier, and I think there's a lot of exciting work to be done in this area. We know a fair bit about germination of many of these species, but we don't know how to get them back necessarily into species poor grasslands. If we crack that, things are going to be a lot better. So I'm going to challenge you, next time you're out in a grassland, looking at all the lovely diversity, look for evidence of seedlings, because they're the future of that grassland. To avoid the extinction debt, we have to get these things to regenerate. So just like the big old red gums in paddocks, beautiful as they are, if they're not regenerating, they're going to die at some point. So when you're in a grassland, look for the future. Come to recognize what the future looks like. It's going to be rare, might vary for species in different years, but we need to see evidence of it. It might depend on really rare coincidence of climate and suitable microsites. So we've got to value seeds. So we can't burn them off in the middle of summer and have no opportunity for regeneration the following autumn. So Aggie, I'd like to conclude by just enthusing everyone to become a grassland champion if you aren't already. And I know many of you already are. We've got to protect, and we're in so much better nick than we were 25 years ago. So thank you to all of you who have been working tirelessly to do this. But protection alone isn't going to be enough. We need to enhance, to stop or reverse that extinction debt idea. We've got a long way to go there. We've got to restore, clearly. That might be for connectivity or to improve habitat areas. We do have the technology, but we've not much thought about where should we do it and what species should we put back. And we have to continue to agitate. This is a global issue. The extinction of grasslands on the VVP is of something that is concerned state and nationally and globally. Think more than just about your own backyard. Think about how your backyard connects to everyone else's backyards. And if we do that, we might actually start rebuild the ecosystem, and we might still save most of these species and give them some options for the future. Thanks, Aggie.
That's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for that, John. Now, I know a lot of you have got burning questions, but we are going to go straight over and let Paul get his presentation ready, and we will have questions afterwards. But thank you very much for that, John. That was brilliant. So while Paul is getting his presentation ready, I'll just read a little bit about Paul for you. So this is Dr. Paul Gibson-Roy is a restoration ecologist specialising in re-establishing species-rich native grasslands and grassy woodlands. In 2004, he investigated the Victorian Grassy Ground Cover Project, instigated project through Melbourne University and Greening Australia, a statewide field-scale grassy restoration program. In 2011, he expanded the project to New South Wales, focusing on EPBC-listed Cumberland Plain grassy woodland. There he developed one of the country's most advanced seed production facilities, growing wildflowers and grasses for restoration across the region. He was awarded a Churchill Fellowship in 2016 and toured the USA investigating their native seed and restoration sectors. In 2017, he co-developed an ANPC-led native seed sector survey, gathering critical information and feedback from restorationists nationally. In 2019, he joined Calbar Resources to oversee rehabilitation strategies for the Fingerboards project in East Gippsland, Victoria. These include ambitious goals to restore nationally listed grassy woodland to approximately 200 hectares of the post-mined landscape. This will involve developing significant seed production capacity to underpin seed resource needs for that restoration. So that's pretty incredible, and clearly I think really sort of comes down to everything that we're talking about today. So without further ado, I will hand over to Paul to give our final presentation. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Aggie. Cool. Well, I think you can hear me, and I think that echo will disappear. It seems to have for everyone else. Wow, what a morning! And John, for heaven's sakes, I just about gave you a standing ovation here in Collaroy after that. I'm sure lots of other people were thinking the same thing, and the same goes for all the other speakers. What a great morning! So it sounds like all of us have been talking before this and putting our heads together and saying what we're going to talk about today. I know that wasn't the case, but there's an enormous amount of overlap. So what I'm going to talk about resonates with just about what everyone else has spoken with, both the Johns, Lincoln, Aggie, Amy, whatnot. So I think we're all starting to sort of, sing from the same hymn book, so to speak. Thanks. It's so exciting anyway, as well, to be talking for the Glen Algonquin sort of area. I've had so much great memories of working down there. The stuff I'm going to talk about now, I will focus on that, but I think some of the stuff obviously has a much wider application. So seed production underpinning innovative approaches to grassland restoration. There's an awesome little shot there of Woorndoo again at the Common, just some of the houses in the background. So again, it's John and everyone are talking, what are we trying to preserve in these gorgeous landscapes? It's a whole bunch of stuff. It's biodiversity, it's rarity, whether that's annuals or perennials or orchids or whatever your thing is, whether it's red gums, whatever. We're after habitat, and as John said, we're after function. We want these things to really work together. But it's more than that, isn't it, really? It's beauty. Look at these damn things. They're gorgeous, even when they're not in flower. We're talking about history. We're talking about our history of our life. We're talking about history of our generations. We're talking about history that goes back tens of thousands of years. And in that same sort of thing, culture. So recent culture, historical culture, long-term culture. We're talking about whimsy. We're talking about hope. So this is really a big deal. And I think all of us, really got to take this sort of stuff seriously. So, when you start to see these beautiful little pockets of, what I'm sort of just flicking through here, you can see there diversity, whimsy, you can see all those gaps and function. You can get a sense that things are working in that. John mentioned things like Thai lotus, nestled in there between all the lovely grasses and the big red gums in the background. What a sight, boy. You want to roll around and stuff like this. Look at that again. These are the very important landscapes. And as John just, talked about, we're watching them disappear. Now, we're doing better than we have for many years in terms of conservation, but they're still going backwards. We know we're still losing them. So as John pointed out, we've got to conserve, we've got to enhance, and we've got to restore. These things are just too wondrous to let slip through our hands. And again, you know, roadsides, little commons, again, you know, these little common landscapes where we've got, you know, agriculture. John Del Prat earlier talked about themata, you know, these beautiful themata grasslands. Aggie talked about them. Amy talked about them in terms of their summer green growth and lower biomass, you know, the floral diversity, you know, grassy woodlands, you know, grasslands, grassy woodlands, that sort of weird continuum. So these things can morph and they are all really important landscapes. So again, that's sort of what I'm talking about, and really just flowing on from what everyone else was speaking about. So what do the grasslands that, you know, all those beautiful little things that I've just gone through have in common? Well, you know, function, beauty, rarity, all those wonderful things. Here's a few other things. They were all restored grasslands. Now, and again, I'm, you know, sort of not blowing anyone's trumpet here. A lot of people have been investing time and energy in this, as John Del Prat pointed out earlier. This sort of stuff demonstrates that we can put back grasslands to a really high standard. So 20, 30 years ago, if you'd sort of said, you know, that you could roll out that set of pictures that I've just put forward and that they would all be restored grasslands, you would have been howled down or laughed out of a room. Here we are, 20, 30 years later, a whole bunch of people have invested an awful lot of time and effort, and that's where we've got to. So that is an incredible thing, because as John said, we're watching these things almost disappear, and we're at a point where the extinction debt is right before us, so we could plummet further off a cliff. So the fact that we can do what you've just seen is world changing in terms of grassland world, okay, or grassy woodland world. But here's the other really big thing. All those grasslands that you've just seen all relied on seed production to some degree to supply the seed in the quantity. We can't get it from the landscape because they're so rare in quantity. The quality, John Morgan talked about seed quality. You know, how do we get the quality of seed to either propagate the plants or to do the direct seeding, as Dave Franklin was doing in an early shot? And how do we get the diversity to enhance, to put back structural complexity, species complexity? Seed production allows us the way to do that. All those sites were from locations where, and these are big critical points, they took a lot of effort to sort of figure out those what seemed like fairly simple points, but that weed seed and nutrient loads have been modified. So essentially we're talking about nutrient loads from agronomic or arable landscapes being reduced so that they're more in line with what would have been an historic nutrient level, and also removing some of that weed seed load that's been reintroduced by agriculture. So here we go. Why seed production isn't so critical? Again, seed productions, as I said, they reduce the impact of repeated collection on our wild populations. Wild populations are still critical because that's where you get your genetic resource for seed production. But seed production uses a range of techniques that we've spent thousands of years, in Australia even, many people would argue tens of thousands of years, developing methods of treating and agronomic horticultural, learning to work with plants so that we can grow them for seed or whatever purposes, cultural purposes. So we use those agronomic and horticultural techniques to grow a wide range. There's a whole different range of different ways that seed production can work. There's no one system fits all. A whole bunch of species can be grown on those different ranges. And you can see just a couple of shots there. You can produce high quality seed for direct seeding or propagating plants. Numerous genetic individuals can be grown in relatively small areas. and they allow a high level of management over many of the things that will, shorten seed production in the wild, whether that's sheep coming on, wildfire, drought or whatnot. You can control all those factors. Here's a couple others that I point out, and John's talk and others' talks sort of prompted me to think this. Bringing in critical species like annuals. Again, we can bring those into seed production and set up crops and populations in production so that those things can produce the amounts of seed to go back into the wild. Same thing for rare and threatened species. So, they can be very critical. You can see some of the things I'm talking about here in terms of the basic elements of seed production. You can see here that these plants are growing essentially in monocultures. They're growing in modified soils or in areas where weeds have been strictly controlled. Moisture is being supplied. These systems can be very simple. And as you can see here, those sorts of systems are ideal for, small groups. You've got a farm, you want to emboss your native vegetation in and around the farm over a period of years. You can set up a very simple system. Landcare groups and people like that can set up these sort of systems. They can increase in complexity. You see a shot there at the bottom of John standing near some containers at David Franklin's. Again, varying levels of sophistication of containerized systems. And there you can see in the ground as a field plot. But these things can be done at larger scales when you're talking about supplying seed for larger areas, for example, for regions or LGAs, for things like that. So again, a lovely shot on the top right of Chris Finlay, Kate Hill at Flora Vic. Wonderful job setting up grass production. Other people have done it. Here's some sites that I've been involved with a lovely team of people, including Sam Craig and a whole bunch of others in New South Wales. Again, you can see large scale production. Here, there's probably over 150 species growing of Cumberland Plains species. Now, these things, this particular site represented the largest, accumulation of those species in that region. And that produces seed to go back into the landscape. Again, scale, I'll just flick through these, but it gives you some idea of what's involved. You can grow these things at, agronomic scale. You need sheds and things in the background to produce them. Again, you can set up large crops of things like wildflowers and daisies and lilies. But what you're aiming for is these large volumes of seed for harvest, and obviously then, for storage and use. So again, some of the infrastructure when you're scaling up these sort of things. So John Del Pratt talked about earlier about jobs and economy. These are the sort of things that we need to probably work towards in regional levels, where we're setting up systems where people essentially are getting, a viable work career out of these things. And that's what you need to do this sort of stuff at scale. So again, here's some of those pictures that I described. They're all restored grasslands, and all of them relied on seed production to do that. So more than anything, this tells us that we really need to take seed production seriously. And I don't think at all that that's been the case over the last 20 years. And I think that's a crying shame that organisations like DELP and CMA, same thing in New South Wales, local land services, state departments, need to focus on seed production and provide support for developing seed production capacity. So how do I see this going in terms of the possibilities? So again, I'm really going to get a tag team with John Morgan again here, and I'm focusing here on the Glenelg reason, but of course, what I'm talking about, I believe very strongly, goes much beyond that. The applications go beyond that. But what's unique about the Glenelg, Woorndoo, Hamilton, whatever region, is that there has been some extraordinary work done there that ties together different sort of examples of what other people have spoken about, that says, okay, we've tested a whole bunch of things here. Can we start putting these together in a more cohesive framework along the lines of what John Morgan was talking about to progress over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 odd years? So here are the key elements. People have been doing some very serious stuff since at least 2005. I know probably before that. There's been seed production capacity, albeit small and albeit not particularly well supported, but it's there in your region. So you've got some wonderful people who have been spending time in doing this. You've got some wonderful enthusiastic support in that region. You have some of the best remnant communities in Victoria. Now, that's a great joy and essentially a great responsibility. So you've got all those elements. And again, I'm just going to flick through that. So these are completely separate to the earlier shots I showed you, restore grasslands. But I want you to sort of dwell on this top sort of section here, because it will make some sense in a little while, I hope, if any of what I'm saying makes sense. The farm-based restoration. So there have been restorations on farm in that region. Now, I'm talking about Moyston here. Strictly speaking, I think it's in the Wimmera catchment, but it's just up the road. This paddock here, essentially, when we started here, looked exactly like the Cape Weed paddock. It was just an extension of that. So the whole thing looked like that. We seeded it, we scalped it, we took away the weed load. It wasn't a particularly big nutrient load. There it is with a wallaby grass sward. It wasn't a particularly high diversity seed mix, it was a grassy mix. There it is in 2007. What a handsome man. There it is in 2011. There it is in 2017. So again, it was at a time of the year when there wasn't a lot of biomass. You can see here that the Cape weed's still in the other paddock, but essentially it hasn't got into here. Why I'm showing you this is because, again, it's very important for us to understand, do these things persevere? Are they able to maintain their structure and integrity? This was always a simple grassland. It's maintained its simplicity. So as John was saying, we could enhance that. But it's been structurally stable. That's a very important thing. Here's a farm-based restoration in Chatsworth at Dave Franklin's place. So there's Dave in 2007. We scalped it in 2006. You can see the pioneers going in there, the wallaby grass. There it is in 2011. John Del Pratt was talking about later, the Themata takes a while to come through. There it is. There's the Themata. There it is. Dave sent me a picture of this a few weeks ago. It's now a lot of wallaby grass in there. These things wax and wane. It depends on when you're looking at it, what the conditions are locally. Here's another one in Hamilton, farm-based restoration. Again, on an agronomic, this is at the research centre. There it is in 2008. So you can see the grasses, the forbs. Look at that. Wonderful. 2009, 2010, 2017. Still complex, still stable. Obviously there are management issues around that, but you can see that these things have maintained themselves over time. Now that's a really important thing, because people are questioning, and some are very much doubting. I certainly know in New South Wales, I've heard it in Victoria, in South Australia, people are questioning whether you go to all these efforts to restore a grassland and they just fall apart at some point. Well, it's not for me to say whether or not they are perfect, but here is some evidence to suggest that under certain conditions, with certain setting up parameters, that these sites that I'm showing you have persevered over a decade, and in some cases near 15 years. Here's another one. Dave Franklin did this for the Dunkeld Pastoral Company. Again, this is just a shot I took of it. But again, demonstrating that you can put together these key elements of a grassland that John Morgan would say you might then enhance. Woorndoo, John Del Pratt showed this earlier, 1 year site. Here's their early site, 7 years on. Now, for heaven's sakes, most of us, whether we're botanists or students or whatever, if you'd stumbled upon that grassland and didn't know where it would come from, you would say, oh, of course, that's an historic grassland. So just the fact, and this is a roadside, sorry, I missed my key point. These have been established on roadsides. So really important factor. We've got farm side, roadside. Here again, John Morgan very kindly showed these shots of the Wycliffe sites. These were just containing completely woody trees. So these, and you might know the Wycliffe site. Sorry, someone's exiting. The Wycliffe sites are beautiful remnants along this, but these were weedy patches in between. So there it is in 2010, 2017. And I'll just talk to, John was talking about benefits of connections. So here we are, we've connected here and here. You can see here that we've found that a lot of the species like leucochrysum and others have extended out into the remnant. So we've got movement of species out of here that weren't there originally. We've also got species moving from those remnants into these sites. So things like drosseras, and we've got orchids moving in. So that connectivity movement, we've already been able to see that this actually does work in Australia. So that's a wonderful thing. There it is in 2017. I got these shots this morning from Frank Carlin. So these are just some shots. He was out there recently. That site has a very large population now of Rudidosus, the button wrinklewort. So again, there's 4 naturally threatened species in here, but that represents a very large population of button wrinklewort. Here's another one up the road. So again, 2010, 2017, and here's a shot from just the other day. Chris Finlay sent me this. So again, these things are maintaining their integrity under the conditions that they were set up and under the conditions under which they've been managed. And on this roadside, it's been the annual burns from the wonderful CMA group. So how does this all fit together? Okay, so we've got these wonderful examples in the Glenelg region, but well beyond that, in different parts of Victoria, in South Australia, Andrew Fenny, Sean Thompson, you know, the Finlays and others of the world in New South Wales, the Craigies, Tim Berryman's, others doing work in New South Wales. We know it can be done on farms. We see from Glenelg Hopkins that it can be done on roadsides as well. Now, those roadside corridors are very critical because we have some access to land that potentially can be used, and essentially trying to get rid of those, you know, sort of high biomass phalaris landscapes. But I've come up with what I'm terming farm-side roadside restoration. There you go. There's my stab at immortality. Farm-side roadside restoration. So I'm trying to find a way that we can put all these elements together of what John Dill Pratt was talking about, what John Morgs was talking about, and what a whole bunch of other people were talking about, Lincoln and others. So we use roadside restoration to link remnant grasslands. So we've already done that at Wycliffe, and we've done it to a certain degree in other places. We use roadside restoration to recreate grassland on areas of roadside where it just wasn't there. Woorndoo's, the Landcare group, has done that. We use farm-side restoration, farm-side, I'll talk about that in a little bit more, to expand the roadside corridor, to try and increase the extent and complexity and function of road remnants on roadsides. So we know we can do it on farms. We've done it. So we're just putting the two together. And we use those farm side and roadsides to improve species diversity, bring in the annuals, bring in the perennials, bring in grasses that have moved out, bring in the rare and threatened. Now this presents for us an opportunity to work collaboratively. So we can bring in the CMAs, the LGAs, Vic Roads, landholders, seed growers, seed productionists, restorationists, the CMA, the community, all those groups can work together on something like this. There is not only the potential, but the need then for resource sharing, the sharing of equipment, whether that's in site prep or site management, expertise, things like that. What this model proposes is that it takes up a very small area of a farm side, essentially, you know, strips, linear strips, effectively equivalent to the roadside remnant, and linear and wide, and I'll show you that. And in terms of the management, a lot of people will talk about, oh, scalping, this is the end of the world of topsoil removal, but essentially you're just shifting that topsoil back into the farm footprint. So that's where it's wanted, that's where the nutrients are wanted, and that really reduces the cost because you're not really moving things a long way. So the key elements are seed production. You need seed production to do this. You need to incentivise farmers, so farm rental payments. This is what I saw in America, and they've programs over there in America have established millions of hectares of restored grassland on farms and on roadsides by incentivising farmers through farm rental payments. So they contribute to setup costs, and then there's an ongoing rental payment. And in America, it's done over 10-year blocks. But we could do something similar like that once we got out of something like a trial program. And then a lot of coordination with the planning groups to assist either the landholders or the roadside groups in terms of site prep, restoration and management. So what does it look like? I've just taken a picture of the Glenelg Highway, but this is what I think it would look like in practice. And in truth, this is what it already has started. So that this particular shot shows one of the grassland remnants, that the roadside restorations that I showed you earlier. So it would involve, here we go, we've got roadside remnants. You're connecting the remnants by restoration. So you're increasing the roadside corridor, as Morgs was saying. You're increasing the connectivity. But here's the cool thing about this. By taking very small amounts of the farm side part, essentially that fence there doesn't become the barrier. You move your fence line back into the farm, so you're really only talking 20, 30, 40, 50 metres. Many landholders are very open to this. I know a whole bunch of farmers who have said to me time and time again, I would like to do more of this. This isn't eating into a huge amount of the farm income. This is a very small area. And again, if they're incentivised, the area of land loss is small, but if they're compensated for that in terms of what they would have produced there, then again, it becomes a part of their farm system. But all of a sudden, by doing this, you've doubled your road corridor. And if you're pushing these things along strategic corridors, all of a sudden you're going from a 2 or 3 chain road to a 6 chain corridor. Could you imagine this? If this is Wycliffe at one end up here and we've got Dunkeld at the other, you're working for the next 20 years, all of a sudden you've got this beautiful big long 6 chain corridor of roadside, farm side remnant. Boy, I'm almost jumping up and down in my little seat here in Coleroy. So what are the potential outcomes? There's a whole bunch of them. You've got reliable seed availability through your seed production. You've got to support a regional seed production capacity. So that's a very important, it's a key point. And when you do that, you've got seed on an ongoing basis. You know, you can plan for it. You can strategically manage what you're trying to do. You've got continual enhancement of degraded roadsides back to native vegetation. So you're getting rid of all that phalaris and you're returning it to native vegetation. You're significantly increasing the roadside footprint for grasslands. You're enhancing cooperation between landholders and public agencies, and that's got to be a good thing. We need to do more of that. You're providing financial and environmental incentives for farmers. So there are environmental environmental service benefits from farmers as well, but there also needs to be financial ones. Wildflower trails for tourism. Could you imagine in your region, you've got 20, 30, 40, 60 kilometre corridors of those beautiful landscapes. They will become a trail for tourism, whether it's for cultural, for the local Indigenous people, for local people from towns, for Wycliffe and Hamilton or wherever it is. People are coming to these. And in America, there are huge wildflower trails that extend, hundreds of kilometres, because road agencies there have invested over 20 and 30 years in restoring native vegetation to their roadside. So it can be done. And again, here's the other fantastic thing. These are low biomass fuel load roads. So again, they'll reduce management fees. And here's the other stuff: biodiversity, habitat, rarity, function, beauty, culture, history, whimsy, there's the artist in me, and more. So my take-home stuff, there is that stupid little fellow in the wildflowers. Please be brave. You've got to be brave to do this. We can't just sit around hoping this stuff happens. We've done enough now to really understand the key elements. We've got to put them together. So be brave and make it happen, because it can be done. Thank you very much.
That was absolutely brilliant, Paul. I think everyone will agree that was just really, really informative. So thank you. So now that's great because you've actually given us another 8 minutes for questions, Paul. So
I always try to please, Aggie.
Oh yeah, and I actually remember that photo getting taken, I think, unless you probably posed like that quite a few times, I'd say.
I am a poser, you know that.
It's all good. Now, John Delpratt, you might like to get yourself off mute too now, because we are into our question and answer session. So look, there have been so many questions coming through on the chat, and I've been trying my hardest to answer bits and pieces as I can. But now look, first off, Colin and Wendy Cook have had lots of questions, so I might actually open up to Colin and Wendy first off, if you'd like to take yourselves off mute, Colin, and ask your question.
Okay, I should be off mute. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, it's just responding to something that somebody put up on the chat talking about urban areas. Years ago, when I was when we were working with DELWP to apply for grants for funding, one of the groups was involved in councils, and they were looking to get people to use their nature strips as seed production areas. So, you know, the whole idea of the project was that, you know, they would go out and plant particular native species on people's nature strips and then come back and harvest the seed from them. I could chase up which particular group that was if you're interested and send you the information, but that project was one that was funded. So, you know, that they should have some results from that. Yeah, that the council was happy for it to happen as long as the species involved wasn't more than a certain height. So, you know, you get all these wonderful little nature strips full of interesting little native vegetation, much better than the standard stuff you had to mow every second week.
Could I interrupt there then, Aggie?
Yeah, please do, Paul.
Colin, just a bit of info on that. So, two of the shots that I've showed in that early, you know, sort of run through of, you know, wonderful looking grasslands, two of the most beautiful looking wildflower ones that I talked about as commons, they were both restored council grasslands, wildflower meadows on council areas. So in Sydney, we've worked with Grantdell. I've done work with Grantdell in the Camden Council, and we've got essentially two wonderful little wildflower meadows that, you know, extraordinary in complexity and how wonderful they look, but they're on two of their other reserves. So these are both almost a hectare in size. We've restored grassland and grassy woodland there. So can it be done in urban areas? Absolutely it can, and there are sites in Western Sydney that absolutely demonstrate it can be done, and I really hope over time that those sites get a higher profile, because we need to be doing those in Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane and Adelaide and a whole bunch of other places.
Thank you.
Aggie, can I jump in?
Hi, John. Yep, sure.
Catherine may even be listening as I speak, because she's out monitoring her installation. Now, she's a PhD student with us at the university, and she has installed grassy understory, complex grassy understory along Gatehouse Street. For those of you living in Melbourne, it's at the Royal Park end of Gatehouse Street. It extends for quite some distance along there. It's looking wonderful at the moment. So yes, that's Melbourne City Council, Melbourne University, getting together to start this sort of work on beside Royal Park, possibly eventually moving into Royal Park. So get yourself down there and have a look at Gatehouse Street, and you might even meet Catherine. She's down there a lot of the time, keeping monitoring and keeping everything else going. Thanks, Aggie.
Thanks for that, John. Now, Adrian Martins, you had your hand up, and I think I accidentally put your hand down. Did you have a question? Adrian? No. Okay. Well, the floor's open, guys. So if you've got a question, pop your hand up and we'll go through. Okay, well, while we're waiting, I'm going to ask a question. Paul, as far as starting up this this seed production, because this is something that in Glenelg Hopkins we have been trying to toy with the idea, how can we get this happening, starting on a very small scale, and this is something we'd really like to do with traditional owner groups as well, and specifically starting on food plants possibly. But seeing the scale that you're on, like, do you have some recommendations, or is there somewhere I could go to find more information about how we go about starting something like this up? Obviously, I'm surrounded by amazing resources, and obviously David Franklin I've already had a chat to, and this amazing group. But I'm assuming that there's resources available, or somehow we can work out how we can start, take the first steps to doing something like this.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, people like myself and Chris Finlays and people like that of the world, I'm sure would always be willing to, sort of pass on their knowledge. But there is a seed production flora bank guideline. So the flora bank guidelines have recently been updated, and new guidelines have been written for seed production. So that is likely to come out in the next 3 to 6 months. So that's been done through the AMPC and Healthy Seeds project. And also the Society for Ecological Restoration International, SCR, have just recently published a whole set of standards for seed use in restoration. And one of the standards is in relation to seed production. And again, there's a whole bunch of authors who wrote that. Simon Pedrini is the lead author, but that is open access. So all you would have to do is to look for that on the SCR. I think it's through Restoration Ecology. It's a special edition on that. So both those things together. Land of Sweeping Plains, of course, that wonderful book published some time ago. John Dill Pratt and I wrote a chapter on seed, and there is a lot about seed production in that. But really the key elements, I think, Aggie, are, I mean, you can get a sense from those slides that I showed that the technology itself can be, sort of either simple or becoming more complex. Really what you need is a piece of land to do it. You need a budget, and you need a timeline and a clear set of goals, and then you build around that. So, for example, my goal to restore 250 hectares of grassy woodland, we've got a 15 to 20 year timeline to do that. So I've got to set up a production system that will set up, will enable me to reach that goal. Now, Charlie talked earlier about, regional catchment strategies, long-term visions. And again, I think if you're doing that, then that's the sensible way to say, okay, if we want to get to this goal in 20 years, what is it that we've got to put into, either not up front, but over time, into seed production? But I can guarantee you, if you can set up and maintain seed production, and that really means involving people, expertise, all those sort of things grow over time, as does the seed resource, then you will be able to learn as you go, bring in new information. But if you don't really plan and fund for it, then it won't happen. While it's intermittent, while it's a few phone boxes here and there or a field day here and there, it won't work. You've really got to be serious about it.
Yep, that's great. Thanks, Paul. Now we've got Marion has got her hand up next, and then Keith after that. So Marion, do you want to take yourself off mute and talk about your 30% cover? Marion, can you hear me? Okay, maybe while we're waiting for Marion, Keith, do you want to fire away with your question? And remember, you need to take yourselves off mute.
Thanks very much, everyone. Really liked the presentations this morning from all the speakers, and the topic is amazing. I guess my question would go to Paul. G'day again, Paul. Great to see you still in this work again. We're doing a little bit of work with CSIRO looking at beneficial insects, and I was just interested to find out if there's been any work done on the grassland restorations that are involving beneficial insects, and in relation to what you've just spoken about, trying to get extra land along the roadsides, which incorporate farming country, and looking at beneficial insects for assistance to landholders, natural assistance to landholders, integrating those opportunities into their enterprise, and to look at blending those natural and production assets to incorporate grassland restorations. Thank you.
Cool, Keith. Thank you very much for the question. Yeah, look, absolutely. Very early on when we were doing these, the early stages of the GGRP, we had Amanda Cobalt and who worked with Alan Yen, and obviously Alan and Amanda have done a lot of invertebrate work demonstrating how valuable remnant grasslands are. Amanda's early work on some of our restored grasslands, and we didn't publish this, we should have, and we did try, demonstrated quite clearly that in our restored grasslands, the invertebrate complexity was much higher than in the surrounding areas. So that early work tended to suggest that they were working in this respect. In more recent times, in Sydney, we've had students through Western Sydney Uni looking interestingly at our seed production areas, because again, once we set up these wonderful resources, we were finding that we were getting all these crazy sort of wonderful things visiting them. And so we've got now a PhD student, but also we had a master's student before that, and they're publishing and studying work on the invertebrate colonisation of not only seed production areas, which is actually quite remarkable, but that's given us the confidence to say, okay, this is happening to such a degree that we've been setting up plots in rural regions, on farm sites and in orchards and things like that. And what we're finding already is by setting up these little wildflower strips and including grasses for structure, but essentially what we're finding through Lena's work is that we're providing a much longer food resource for invertebrates and for pollinators, to also create pollinator services for the agricultural business, but also these things are providing important habitat for native invertebrates. So I guess in answer to your question, yes, when we're restoring this complex habitat, we're finding all sorts of fauna, including invertebrates, are moving back in and colonising and residing in there. Now, often that comes down to scale, but at small scales, a lot of things like invertebrates and things can get into them. At bigger scale, then you're talking about, some of the bigger fauna. And keep an eye out, and I can send through some of the early papers to Aggie, talking about some of the work that Lena and Nina did. But Lena's a PhD will finish in about 6 or 7 months, and keep your eye out for that, because I think that will be really interesting to a lot of people interested in the additional benefits to restoring, floral complexity.
Can I quickly add, Aggie?
Yeah, sure.
Thanks, Keith. One of the things we've done a couple of years ago, and these are in linear high quality remnants of grasslands that are but agricultural areas, carabid beetles, which are native predators, are way higher in the good quality grasslands, and they control slugs. And if you don't know about slugs in the Western Plains, all of them are exotic species. So every slug you ever see in Western Victoria is an exotic species. So the carabids seem to race around, basically eating them. And so that's one of your beneficials. And so I think there is definitely something in carabid beetles, grassland quality, and slugs.
John, as well, Amanda found exactly the same thing. Those guys were higher in our restored sites as well, just coincidentally.
That's great, guys. Thank you. Now, Marion has been waiting very patiently, and we've got her off mute, so go for it, Marion.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Good. I'm on my mobile, so I've got a complex situation here. 30% rule. Back in the early days of Landcare, Potter Farmland Plan had shown that if you set aside 30% of your farmland for nature, then you would maximise your productivity, whether it was grazing or cropland. And I've noticed a lot of studies overseas that have been replicating those results. Can we use that as an incentivisation for farmers? The other incentivisation is trust for nature covenanting, which I believe means that they can reduce their rates on that parcel of land.
Just in terms, Marion, just in terms of the 30%, I'm glad you've picked that up. It seems to repeat itself over and over. It's almost like a threshold. If you're going to do anything, if you can get to 30%, that seems really critical. Beyond that, you know, the gains are less. That's just how it works. And so that's come up repeatedly in different ecosystems in Australia and overseas. So I think it's a really good aspirational goal in agricultural landscapes. I mean, the reality is we still have to accept these are agricultural landscapes. So how do we coexist nature conservation, whatever you want to call all this other stuff, and farming? It's that 30% that may well be something that is, you know, something we could aspire, and thinking about where it's got to go in the landscape. How do you make it work within that landscape? We've seen how quickly landscapes are transitioning in Western Victoria from sheep now to canola and bloody hell wheat of all things. We've got wind farms, you know, starting up. So I don't think it's beyond the pale to suggest these are things that we should be aiming for, and it's people like us, it's champions like us that are going to be the ones that push for things like this, because it won't come from government. They'll follow. I'm not sure they'll lead.
I'm in government and busy writing climate change adaptation plan for transport, and they're the sort of goals we're trying to build into it.
That's great.
Yeah,
fantastic.
So,
well,
yeah,
thanks, Marion.
Don't say government won't do it, because we helped start Landcare, and I think, you know, the heart's there, and there's enough people pushing, it will happen.
And I think that the two-prong, if we can do it from the ground up clearly as well, then it will happen much faster.
Yeah.
Can I make a point as well there, guys? 30% is, to a lot of farmers, is a lot of land. So that potentially could be 30% reduction in their income. So that's a really big deal. And I reckon this is why for a long time we keep saying, farmers, please do, farmers, please do. But we don't really provide an economic incentive for them to do it. So things like soil carbon is potentially an interesting thing, and I'm already looking to that in our project. But I would urge people to look to the United States for an example there, where their conservation reserve program and other link projects programs provide financial incentives for farmers to essentially treat returning or conserving native vegetation to parts of their landscape, and that could be up to 30%, as essentially a piece of their farm income. So essentially you're not asking them to get poorer. You're saying, okay, if you put this back, you will continue to get income, but you also get all these ecosystem services. So you're getting reduced soil loss, you're getting reduced movement of nutrients into waterways, all those sort of other benefits. But unless we start doing that like the Americans have, we'll be talking about this in another 20 years, where in the last 20 or 30 years, the Americans have put back 23 million acres of native vegetation onto farmscapes through this incentive type program. So unless we start seriously doing that, this is governments and farm organisations really talking together and saying, what is the Australian version of that? Unless we do that, we are just kidding ourselves.
Whole farm planning is another approach where you look at land that is not very usable because it's rocky, stony, weed infested or rabbit infested, and you don't put your fence lines in straight lines. If you're cropping, you fence off your corners because you can't turn a circle with a large cropping machine. So there's a whole range of ways you can look at it.
Thank you for that. Now, yes, John, I see you've just put your hand up. I really hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we have gone past our 12:30 and we really are wanting to stick to that. I think for there's a few of you still who have your hands up. So the chat will still be open so long as you stay on this link. So perhaps if you can type your question down, and hopefully our wonderful presenters will be happy to stay on after for a little bit longer to maybe answer questions. But also remember we are recording this, and I've got all your email addresses too, so there are still ways we can communicate. But so I might actually jump ahead, Colin and Jess, and just go to John, because I'm tipping you might be having something to say about finishing up. John Del Pratt. And John, you're on mute. No, we can't hear you. Oh. Sorry, John, you might need to do the jump out and jump in again. So, okay, John? John, you're on mute. Okay, that's a pain. We can't actually hear John. Now, look, Susan, are you there?
I'm here.
Yes, okay. Now, do you want to do a little signing off and until we
I
get
can do that. I'll have to ad lib a little bit. John was meant to be doing that, but look, I think the day has been a just an amazing success, and I would want to say on behalf of the Woorndoo Land Protection Group, thank you to all the participants. I counted at one stage, we had certainly over 100. I'd also urge you all to follow us on our Facebook page, Woorndoo Land Protection Group. We'll approve all your applications to join, and it would be a great way of you keeping up. And finally, I'd just like to say thank you very much to all our amazing presenters, to John Morgan, to Lincoln Kern, to Paul Gibson-Roy, to John Del Pratt, and did I say Amy Jackson? Have I said everybody? Anyway, thank you all so much. It's been so inspiring. I'm going to go away and talk to my husband later on and see if I can't set up some grassland paddocks on our farm. So anyway, we'll see how that goes. But I'll leave you all to continue chatting if you want to stay involved this afternoon. And thanks, Aggie, so much for organising today. It's just been absolutely brilliant and inspiring. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Susan, and thanks again to all our amazing speakers. Now John looks like he's actually back here. John, can we hear you? John, can you hear us?
I can hear you. You can't hear me.
Right. Yes, we can now. So do you want to say something else to sign off?
It's a technical issue. I jiggled the right thing. Just harking back to that earlier conversation about the benefits of farmside. Asher Burdett up at the Upper Hopkins Landcare ran a fantastic morning not long ago on regen, and although that focused on perennial exotic crops, I think we've got to try to keep moving ourselves into that space. We have fantastic perennial species, very well adapted to our landscapes, and I'd like to see us much more closely aligned with regen agriculture as well, because of many of the benefits that we've talked about today, and many that we haven't talked about today, for both farmside and roadside veg. I'm a great supporter of public land conservation because the community has an interest and a control of that. And the more we do, the less the intermittent and occasional damage that occurs to it, the less that is impactful on a proportional basis. If we can just get a lot more of it, then we can start to stop panicking every time there is some area of damage. Even if it's inadvertent, it's still often permanent. But if we can just the area that we have available, it also then provides opportunities for all those cultural results that we want. We want to get big populations of culturally significant plants, of rare plants. You know, it forms a palette or a matrix to allow us to do that work without interfering with existing remnants, and that applies to both public land and also, of course, the wonderful private land, which people are now more and more interested in talking about. The one thing I do ask, and I do apologise, I think it's Marion, wasn't it? Please don't just give us the really bad bits. This stuff works so much better and so much more easily if we have reasonable land to work on. If it's just the rocky corners, then you've got a whole set of new problems to solve. Tim Hill, who was certainly with us earlier, and I hope he's still there, Tim is very aware of that on Tiverton. You know, we want to be able to do this on rocky areas, but it is so much easier and so much quicker if we've got reasonable land to work with.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Okay, guys, well that is it. I will endeavour to get the link for the recording of this meeting out to everyone. Please, if there are certain bits of information or presentations that you'd like, I haven't actually asked our wonderful speakers yet, but certainly getting bits of information to you. If you bear with me, it's a crazy time of year, but I will certainly endeavour to get things out to you all. But yeah, again, thank you very much, and thank you to the Woorndoo group for allowing me to run this day and not failing too dismally. So thank you very much, and have a good day.
Thanks, Aggie. Thanks for a great day.
Thanks, John Morgan. Thank you very much for that. Was wonderful. You can go to your car now.
It's very hot now.
It's great to see the technology working so well for you, mate.
It just doesn't work at home with 100 people online. That's all. Thanks, John, for again all your hard work. You should be really inspired by inspired, but also very enthused by days like today where we get so much interest. It's fantastic, and it's just going from strength to strength, actually.
Folks, I'm going to sit around here for a little bit longer until I get hungry, and if anyone wants to chat, please please do. Otherwise, I'll just silently steal away at some stage. But yeah, but by now, from now on, it is polite to leave if you choose to.
And you might want to stop recording, Aggie, perhaps.
I think I will stop recording. I'm just there we go.